My name's Chad Boyd. I'm the research leader with the Agricultural Research Service in Burns, Oregon at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center. And I'm going to be talking about strategic management of invasive annual grasses within the biome. Some thank yous are in order. I really want to thank Megan Kreutzberg, who's kind of the co-lead in this work. I want to thank Alex and I want to thank Joe for all of your help with analyses and mapping. Couldn't have done it without you. And I want to thank the whole team. I'm not going to read everybody's name. There's 14 of us on this paper. And I really appreciate your persistence, your ability to think outside the box, and just helping to see this effort across the finish line. It took about a year and a half, so thank you. I want to start out today with a quote. It's one of my favorite Sagebrush Biome quotes. And it was from a gentleman named Hines in 1851, and he said it was actually a diary entry that he wrote down upon encountering the Eastern Oregon portion of the sagebrush biome. And he recorded that this was God-forsaken country that was never designed to be the habitation of a Christian or civilized man. So this was probably not a unique viewpoint at the time. I mean, if you came from the East Coast to the sagebrush biome, it's probably pretty dang scary, right? Where did all the understory go? But this probably, encapsulated kind of the viewpoint of the time. And yeah, as time progressed, we saw some degradation take place of the sagebrush biome. People who had a very anthropomorphic, we need to conquer this thing, we need to tame it type attitude. But humans have an amazing capacity for change, and that's why I put this quote up here. Because if you think about it, here 173 years later, we're sitting in the bowels of the annual meeting of the Society for Range Management, doing what? Talking about how we're going to strategically save the sagebrush biome, the capacity for change. And I want to revisit that at the end of the talk. Okay, as has been stated, we've got some problems in the sagebrush biome. And the stat that really sticks out to me is actually this one at the top. And we're losing 1.3 million acres of core and growth opportunity combined on an annual basis over the last 20 years. That's a lot of ground. And why are we losing that? We're losing that over 70% of the spatial area loss was lost due to ecosystem problems, things like fire, things like annual grasses, things like conifer expansion. And certainly, I think chief among those in terms of the intractability of the problem and the scope of the problem is probably annual grasses. Annual grasses covered just about the whole biome if we look at where they have a presence, a greater than zero value recorded in the last 4 years. If we look at the area where we have substantial impact of invasive annual grasses, say 15% canopy cover or greater, we're looking at about 23 million hectares. So that's about 25% of the biome is being substantially impacted by invasive annual grasses. Another stat that kind of grabs you from Tina's work, I'll quote Tina several times here, about 69% of the loss of core sagebrush areas over the last 20 years is in association with invasive annual grasses. And I think that a big part of the problem here is that we don't yet have a coordinated strategic spatial strategy for how we wrap our brains around dealing with this problem. And more evidence from Tina's group to support that. About 12% of our annual grass treatments at the moment are in core sagebrush areas over the last 10 years. Greater than 50% of our invasive annual grass treatments are in other rangelands. Okay? So does that sound like a strategic approach? That does not sound like a strategic approach to me. But let's turn the tables. If that's not a strategic approach, what is a strategic approach? What should those percentages look like? And that's essentially what our group of 14 did over the last year and a half. We took on that question of how should we allocate effort when it comes to invasive annual grasses over the sagebrush biome, and why? And to wrap our brains around that very large, daunting question, we broke it down into three smaller pieces, basically 3 different questions. And those questions were, first and foremost, where are the areas we can least afford to lose? Okay, where are those areas that we're going to have a tough time getting back, that we haven't lost yet to annual grasses, but if we lose them, we're going to have a tough time getting back? And we thought of those as maintain priorities. And in a maintain priority area, you're going to be thinking about things like, well, it's the domain of early detection and rapid response. Let's get on top of the problem. Let's get on it early. Let's use contact pre-emergent herbicides to take those things out of the system while we can. The second question was, where are those areas where restorative practices are most likely to be successful? And those are improved priorities. That's the improved priority paradigm, if you will. And we ask it that way because if we're going to do annual grass treatments, we should do them where we have a hope of being successful. Other rangelands is probably not where we're going to be successful. Those areas are going to be hard to get back to some semblance of core habitat. So where the restorative practice is most likely to be successful, those are improved priorities. And we're going to think about things like, again, herbicides, maybe more aggressive use of herbicides to knock back the annuals, and maybe bolstering our biotic resistance with plantings of things like native perennial bunch grasses to help increase that biotic resistance. Lastly, where those heavily infested invasive annual grass areas on the landscape where we're not likely to have restoration success. And our paradigm there is we want to contain these. These would be contained priorities. Here we're thinking about things like aggressive use of herbicide along the boundary between contain and maintain or improve areas, trying to contain that problem. We're also probably thinking about things like seeding of aggressive non-native perennials like crested wheatgrass to try to get some level of biotic integrity back into those, in biotic resistance back into those plant communities. So this is what we did. We took these concepts and we made them quantitative, and then we mapped them. We used geospatial tools to map them. So I want to talk about it in that order. We're going to talk about how we made these concepts quantitative first. And first off, the data sources that we used to do so. For vegetation cover, anywhere I talk about that, we used rangeland analysis platform data. We also used Sagebrush ecological integrity from Doherty et al., the Sagebrush conservation design, to get an idea of how close or far away from core we were. We also needed to know something about susceptibility to invasive annual grasses. And just like Jason, we used the inhabit models, which describes the likelihood of invasion for 5 different annual grass species. And lastly, what was the likelihood of invasive annual grass control? That's another piece of the puzzle for our improve areas. And as a proxy, we simply use the latest available iteration of the resistance map for the biome, which is basically soil temperature and moisture. It's abiotic resistance. Okay, so what did we do with those data? Well, we calculated 3 scores for every pixel at a 30-meter scale within the biome. We calculated a maintain priority score, an improved priority score, and a contain priority score. Those scores are going to tell you what the input variables were in a moment, but the end result was, let's just take maintain, a maintain priority that ranges from 0 to 1. Okay, and we did that by taking the geometric means of the input variables, which were all also scaled from 0 to 1. So let's take a look at maintain. How did we calculate that? I could spend all day here. I'm not. I'm going to talk you through it fairly quickly and conceptually. So for our maintain priorities, we wanted areas that had low abundance of annual grasses, had a high risk for annual grasses, and if that risk materialized, in other words, if we had a 15% bump in annual grass cover, we would see an appreciable decrease in sagebrush ecological integrity. Okay, so putting that all together, where do we not have a lot of annual grasses at present? The potential to have more, and if we get more, we got a problem. And those are the areas that we can least afford to lose. Those are our maintain priorities. For improved priorities, we looked at areas that had up to, our max score started at 15% annual grass cover. So we're looking for areas where we do have an annual grass issue going on. We're also looking for areas where we have high resistance And again, that's a proxy for how likely we are to be with how likely success is with invasive annual grass treatment. So we looked at that biotically in terms of perennial forb and grass cover. We had a curved solid line for the west portion of the range, curved dotted line for the east portion of the range. You'll notice it dives off. That's because biotic integrity is a good thing. But if we get more than 40% cover of perennial bunch grasses in the Great Basin, we probably don't need to do an improve treatment in that site. So that's no longer a priority. We also looked at abiotic resistance, and we asked the question, if we can zero out annual grasses, okay, what's going to happen to SEI? And we were looking for those areas where if we zeroed out annual grasses, we would see a significant bump in sagebrush ecological integrity because everything else is largely in place. So again, put it all together, looking for areas that do have an annual grass infestation. They have high biotic and abiotic resistance, indicating potential for success in treatment. If we're successful in treatment, we're going to see a bump in SEI. Those are improved priorities. Contain was pretty straightforward. Contain priorities are areas where we have an annual grass infestation. We don't have a lot of biotic or abiotic integrity as measured by perennial bunch grass cover, perennial forb and grass cover, and abiotic resistance. We then assigned each pixel within the biome to one of three categories: maintain, improve, or contain. And remember, those were between 0 and 1. What we did is we took the highest values. So if we had a pixel in Nevada and it scored a 0.9 for maintain, a 0.7 for improve, and a 0.5 for contain, that would be labeled as a maintain priority, right? Because that's the highest score. Now, if a pixel didn't score above 0.5 for one of those three categories, we threw it in the fourth category. That's our other category, because we figured if you can't score above 0.5, that's probably not a priority area that we need to be looking at. We also put in the other category those areas that classified as other rangelands in the SCD for the entirety of the 20-year analysis period during that work. We then created two maps, a map illustrating maintain, improve, and contain priorities across the biome, and then a second map where we essentially masked it such that we were only looking at areas that were currently core, okay, those priorities within areas that are currently core or have the potential to be core. In other words, if we zeroed out annual grasses, those areas would be core. So let's take a quick look at those maps. These are the biome-wide priorities, and the color ramps, we've got maintain in the low priority scores. Again, we were 0.5 to 1. We took that roughly in thirds and said if you're close to 0.5, you're low priority, maintain. If you're close to 1, you're high priority. If you're in the middle, you get a middle color ramp. So on this map, we've got areas in different shades of blue are maintain priorities. Areas in orange, different shades, are going to be improved priorities. Contain priorities are dark gray. Other areas are in light gray. And what we see with maintain priorities, we've got about 18 million hectares out of 93 million hectares in the biome that classify out as a maintain priority. We've got some strongholds in Wyoming, in the northern Great Basin, east central Idaho. Looking at improved priorities, we've got a huge stronghold in eastern Wyoming, eastern Montana, some in the northern Great Basin, and then our contained priorities more in the central Great Basin and in western Utah. So that's the biome-wide map. Now, if we shrink that down and just look at areas, the same map, just for areas that are currently core or would be core if we zeroed out annual grasses, we shrink the decision space considerably. And again, we did this because we wanted to say, okay, if we really wanted to get serious about just focusing on maintaining and creating cores in areas that have annual grass problems, this is how we do it. We shrink it down to current and potential cores. And we've shrunk down from the biome level on maintain. We've shrunk about 28% down to 13 million hectares out of 93 total in the biome that we can focus on. Our improved priorities shrink 37% down to about 11 million hectares. Okay, one thing to point out, something different than with the SCD, because this can be confusing. In the SCD, and I hope I'm right on this, Kevin, we had a fairly liberal definition of what the maximum level of invasive annual grasses was for cores. We capped it at 25%, for example, for the Great Basin. And that reflects reality because we have quite a range in annual grass abundance values across otherwise intact habitats. We took a much more conservative approach, and if you look at our maintain priorities, in the Great Basin, we had a cap of 15%. And the upshot of that is, just because you're core, it doesn't mean that you don't have an annual grass problem that's worth worrying about. So in terms of the maps, you're going to see a lot of core areas, particularly in eastern Wyoming and eastern Montana, that actually classify out as areas that need to be improved priorities actually, within our system. So just to wrap this up, some strategic implications. I want to quote my colleague Dustin Johnson. Annual grasses should piss you off. They piss me off. And the reason I say it, the reason I put it that way, is I'll tell you, Kevin, the most depressing thing I've ever done professionally is to work on the SCD, because I started in 1999 in the biome, and that's my report card. And a big chunk of that bad report card, that 1.3 million acres a year loss, is associated with annual grasses. And if we're going to be successful with annual grasses, we're going to have to be just as aggressive as they are in our approach to dealing with them. In a nutshell, strategic conservation is all about realizing and acting upon the difference between what we can do and what we should do, right? And along those lines, I think that our maps do a good job of providing an empirical, reasoned starting point for where we need to begin to eat this elephant. And don't underestimate that. That's a big deal in my mind. At the same time, and along the lines of what Kevin said, there's going to be other data sources that come into play. Don't look at the maps that I just showed you, or that will hopefully come out in print soon, as being instruction manuals, because they're not. They are a start, and they're going to be modified by local information. We do this all the time in strategic conservation workshops. First thing we ask when we go into a county, give us the best local information you have, and it's probably better than the biome-wide information we have. It's also going to have to be set within an adaptive framework. Annual grasses are complex problems. They morph in space and time, and therefore the proper approach to dealing with them morphs in space and time has to be set within an adaptive framework. But regardless of the adaptive framework, regardless of the data sources that you use, I want to make the point that the basic concepts of maintaining those areas we can least afford to lose, improving those where we have the best chance of doing so, and containing problems where we must, is an outlook. It's a strategic outlook that can be used at any scale. I use it on 20 acres at my house. We could also use it and have used it at the biome scale. Last point I want to make is what we've done in the past matters, but what we do in the future is going to matter a lot more. And where I'm going with that is I want to give credence to the efforts that have taken place thus far. I think about the potential, or I think about the avoided loss question. In other words, if we'd done nothing, if ever, for annual grasses, if we'd done nothing indirectly in terms of fuels management, in terms of fire suppression, imagine what the biome would look like today. I, for one, think that we have had a strong impact on annual grasses over time. But the flip side of that is that impact has not been sufficient to offset a 1.3 million acre a year loss of corn growth opportunity habitats. That's not sustainable. So something has to change, taking it back to where we started. And we have that capacity for change. And the change that we think needs to happen is a movement, mass movement, from reactive and opportunistic conservation of annual grasses, management of annual grasses, toward a more strategic approach that centers on maintaining those areas we can least afford to use, improving those areas where success is most likely, and containing problems where needed. So thank you for your time.